It began with something so small, so harmless, that most people would have never imagined it could cause trouble. At the edge of my front lawn, right beside a row of neatly trimmed bushes, I placed a little ceramic garden gnome. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't offensive, it wasn't even large, just a small, cheerful figure with a red hat and a mischievous smile. To me, it was a touch of personality, a way to make my home feel warmer and more inviting. But in a neighborhood ruled by a strict homeowners association, personality was something that came at a price. The HOA in my community had always been known for their overreaching rules. Grass could be no longer than 2 inches. Trash bins had to be removed from site within 30 minutes of pickup. Cars parked an inch too close to the curb could earn you a warning letter. Yet, despite these frustrations, most of us tried to play along. We told ourselves it was for property values, though secretly, we all knew it was about control. When I placed my garden gnome in the yard, I thought nothing of it. Neighbors passing by even chuckled and commented on how cute it was. Children walking to school pointed at it with smiles. It was harmless joy. But for the HOA board, especially the president, harmless joy was unacceptable. 2 days after I placed the gnome, I found a letter taped to my front door. It wasn't friendly. It was a violation notice. The letter stated that my unauthorized lawn ornament was in direct violation of the community standards. It demanded immediate removal of the gnome, or else I would face fines of $50 per day until it was gone. At first, I laughed. Surely this had to be a mistake. A gnome couldn't possibly be the hill they wanted to die on. But when I called the HOA office, the president herself answered, and her tone was cold. She insisted that decorative figurines were prohibited unless explicitly approved by the board. She claimed it was about maintaining uniformity in the neighborhood. I was stunned. It was a tiny gnome, barely a foot tall. It wasn't gaudy or distracting. Yet they were treating it like I had painted my house neon green. I tried to reason with them, but the president made it clear. Either the gnome went, or the fines would begin. I decided to leave the gnome where it was. Sure enough, the fines began to stack up. $50 a day, added to my account without hesitation. Within a week, I supposedly owed them $350. Within 2 weeks, the number was climbing toward 1,000. Each time I checked the mailbox, I found another warning letter, more aggressive than the last, and in each one, they reminded me that continued non-compliance could lead to legal action. At first, I felt anger. Then, I felt fear. The HOA wasn't bluffing. I'd seen what they'd done to other homeowners. One family was fined into submission for leaving a kayak leaning against their garage. Another was threatened with foreclosure because of unpaid dues. The HOA thrived on intimidation, and now I was their next target. Still, I couldn't bring myself to give in. It wasn't just about the gnome anymore. It was about principle. How could they tell me what kind of joy I was allowed to have on my own lawn? How could they decide that something so harmless was a crime? As the weeks went on, the letters escalated into official warnings of legal action. One morning I woke to find a notice posted on my door. The HOA board was beginning the process to evict me from my home. Evict me over a garden gnome. Neighbors started whispering about it. Some thought I was reckless. Others quietly supported me but were too afraid to speak out against the board. I began to realize just how much power the HOA truly had, and how much fear they spread among the community. But what the board didn't realize was that I wasn't the type to back down. I wasn't going to let them bully me out of my own home. If they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one. I started documenting everything: the letters, the fines, the threats. I made copies of every notice, logged every phone call, and even took pictures of my harmless gnome sitting peacefully in the yard. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about standing up to an organization that thrived on control and intimidation. As I looked out my window at the gnome, still smiling under its red hat, I felt a spark of determination. I knew the road ahead would be long, and the battle would be messy. But I also knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let them win. And so, the war over the garden gnome had officially begun. The HOA wasn't accustomed to resistance. Most homeowners in the neighborhood fell in line the moment a violation notice landed in their mailbox. They would grumble, maybe complain to a neighbor, but ultimately they complied. That was how the HOA maintained its grip on power, through the expectation of obedience. But my refusal to remove the gnome was a direct challenge to that power, and the board wasn't about to let it slide. Within days of ignoring their demand, the board escalated its campaign. Suddenly, I began receiving letters not only about the gnome, but about other supposed violations. They claimed my grass was a quarter-inch too long. They insisted my trash bin was visible for too many minutes after collection. They even accused me of having an unauthorized structure in my backyard, a laughable lame since I hadn't built anything in years. It was obvious what they were doing. They wanted to bury me in fines and warnings until I buckled under the pressure. Each new notice came with additional daily penalties, and when I logged into my HOA account online, I saw the numbers ballooning into the thousands. According to them, I now owed more than 3 months of mortgage payments, all because I refused to remove a 12-inch ceramic gnome. The intimidation didn't stop at paperwork. One evening, I caught the HOA president herself standing across the street, staring at my house. She wasn't alone. 2 other board members flanked her, clipboards in hand, pointing at my yard as if they were inspecting a crime scene. When I stepped outside, they quickly turned away, but the message was clear. I was under surveillance. Word of my standoff spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors began avoiding me, worried that siding with me would put them in the board's crosshairs. Others whispered encouragement when no one else was around, telling me they admired my courage. A few even admitted they were secretly rooting for me, because they too had suffered under the HOA's iron fist. But quiet sympathy wouldn't pay the thousands in fines the HOA claimed I owed, and it wouldn't stop the eviction proceedings they were now threatening to initiate. The more I resisted, the more aggressive the board became. They wanted me broken, humiliated, and ultimately gone. One morning, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was a formal warning of foreclosure proceedings, signed by the HOA's attorney. The letter stated that if my balance wasn't paid in full within 30 days, they would begin legal action to seize my home. That was the moment the fight became bigger than a gnome. It became about survival. Fear crept in. I'd seen this tactic before. Years earlier, another family had faced foreclosure over unpaid dues. The HOA bled them dry with legal fees until they finally moved out, defeated. Their home was then resold, and the board smugly claimed it was for the good of the community. I knew if I didn't act, I could be next. But instead of backing down, the fear hardened into resolve. They had gone too far. This wasn't just about a small decoration anymore. It was about an abuse of power. And if they wanted a war, I was ready to fight with everything I had. I began researching. Nights were spent hunched over my laptop, digging through HOA bylaws, state laws, and court records. I discovered that while HOAs held incredible power, they weren't invincible. They had to follow specific legal procedures, and many of their so-called rules were vague, outdated, or outright unenforceable. Buried deep in the HOA's governing documents, I found a line that made my heart race. Decorative lawn ornaments were not banned outright. The rules stated only that unsightly structures or items deemed detrimental to community aesthetics were prohibited. But what defined unsightly? It was subjective, and subjective rules were notoriously weak in court. The more I read, the more I realized the HOA had overstepped. Their threats were aggressive, but their foundation was shaky. If I could prove that their enforcement was arbitrary and targeted, I might not only save my home, I might expose them for the bullies they truly were. I also started speaking to neighbors who had suffered under the board. One woman told me about being fined for leaving a flower pot on her porch. Another confessed that she had been threatened with legal action for hanging a small bird feeder. These stories painted a clear picture. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were wielding power like a weapon, using fear to keep everyone in line. Piece by piece, I gathered evidence. Copies of letters, photos of my harmless gnome, testimonies from neighbors, and even recordings of conversations with BOA RD members. Every scrap of proof was ammunition for the battle ahead. By the end of the month, I was ready. The HOA thought they were closing in on victory, but they had no idea what was coming. Because while they prepared their legal threats, I was preparing something much bigger, a counterattack that would shake the entire neighborhood, and maybe even dismantle the board's authority once and for all. The HOA had made one crucial mistake. They underestimated me. They thought I would crumble under the weight of their threats and mounting fines, just like so many homeowners before me. But instead of breaking, I sharpened my resolve. The counterattack began with paperwork. I carefully drafted a formal response to the HOA's violation notices, citing the very bylaws they were using against me. I pointed out the vague language in their rules, highlighting that the term unsightly was never defined. I reminded them that laws required consistency in enforcement, and that targeting me specifically, while allowing other decorations in the neighborhood, was discrimination. I sent the letter not only to the board, but also to their attorney, making sure it was delivered by certified mail. It was my way of saying, I know my rights, and I'm not afraid to use them. But I didn't stop there. The more I investigated, the more evidence of hypocrisy I uncovered. While the board was attacking me for a harmless gnome, several board members themselves were in violation of their own rules. The president's yard, for example, had a massive bird bath that was clearly visible from the street. Another board member had seasonal wreaths hanging on her front door year-round, which technically counted as decorative displays. If my gnome was a crime, then so were their ornaments. I began compiling photographs and notes, building a case that the HOA was enforcing rules selectively, punishing residents I didn't like while ignoring their own infractions. This wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Once I had enough evidence, I quietly started reaching out to neighbors. At first, most were hesitant. They feared retaliation. But when I showed them the proof, letters, photos, testimonies, they began to realize they weren't alone. One by one, people shared their own horror stories. Some had been fined hundreds for minor issues, while others lived in constant fear of receiving a notice in the mail. It was then that I saw the real weakness of the HOA. They ruled through fear, but fear only worked when people felt isolated. If we came together, the board's power would crumble. So, I organized a neighborhood meeting. It wasn't flashy, just a casual gathering in my backyard on a Saturday afternoon. Word spread quietly, and by the time the day arrived, nearly 24 neighbors showed up. Some came out of curiosity, others out of frustration, and a few because they were simply tired of being pushed around. I laid everything out on the table, the letters, the threats, the hypocrisy of the board. I showed them pictures of the board president's bird bath, sitting proudly in her front yard while she condemned my gnome as unsightly. I read aloud the vague and contradictory language of the bylaws, and I explained how the HOA had threatened me with foreclosure over something that wasn't even a legitimate violation. The reaction was immediate. Gasps, angry mutters, and shaking heads filled the group. People began sharing their own stories, louder this time, no longer whispering in secret. One neighbor had been fined for parking her car in her own driveway too many nights in a row. Another had been threatened because her teenage son's basketball hoop was distracting. The more they spoke, the more outrage grew. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. Fear turned into anger, and anger turned into determination. For the first time in years, the community felt united, not under the control of the HOA, but against it. Together, we decided on a plan. We would demand accountability. We would request a full review of the board's actions and finances, and if they refused, we would rally enough votes to remove them entirely. But I wasn't done. I also prepared to take the battle beyond the neighborhood. I contacted a local news outlet, explaining how an HOA was trying to evict a homeowner over a garden gnome while ignoring their own violations. Reporters loved stories like this, small symbols of rebellion against overreaching authority. They agreed to cover it. The stage was set. When the board received my formal response, followed by a notice that the community was organizing against them, they panicked. Their tone shifted from arrogant to defensive. They sent out a mass email insisting they were only upholding community standards and accusing me of spreading misinformation. But by then, it was too late. The seed of resistance had already been planted, and it was growing fast. The HOA wanted to make an example of me, but now they were the ones under scrutiny. Neighbors were no longer afraid. They were demanding answers. And with the media circling, the board's carefully cultivated image of authority began to crack. For the first time since this war began, I felt the tide turning in my favor. But I knew the fight wasn't over. The board wouldn't surrender quietly. They had too much pride, too much ego invested in their power. And as the next HOA meeting approached, I could sense that the coming confrontation would decide everything. The garden gnome sat quietly in my yard, its red hat tilted toward the street, as if smiling at the chaos it had caused, and I couldn't help but smile back. The night of the HOA meeting arrived with a heavy air of tension. For weeks, the board had been doubling down, sending out emails and notices trying to convince residents that they were simply maintaining order. But the more they tried to justify themselves, the more suspicious people became. Their words sounded less like authority and more like desperation. That evening, the community clubhouse was packed. Normally, HOA meetings drew only a handful of people, usually the same ones who wanted to complain about trivial issues. But this time, nearly every seat was filled. Neighbors who hadn't attended a meeting in years showed up, eager to see what would happen. The board members sat stiffly at the front of the room, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. The president, the same woman who had stood across the street staring at my gnome weeks earlier, sat at the center. Her smile was tight, her posture rigid, her eyes flashing with irritation every time she glanced at me. The meeting began as usual, with the board droning on about finances and upcoming community initiatives. But nobody was paying attention. Everyone was waiting for the real issue, the one that had brought them there. When the floor was opened for community concerns, I was the first to stand. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. I laid everything out: the gnome, the violation notices, the fines, the foreclosure threats. Then I held up the photos of the board president's bird bath and the other decorations in board members' yards. The hypocrisy was undeniable. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. People leaned forward, whispering, shaking their heads. The board president tried to cut me off, insisting that my behavior was out of line. But I pressed on, reading directly from the bylaws. The language was vague, inconsistent, and open to interpretation. If my gnome was unsightly, then so were their decorations. Selective enforcement wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. I could see the president's face tightening, her composure slipping as the crowd began to shift in my favor. Then, one by one, neighbors began to speak up. A woman in the back raised her hand and shared how she'd been fined for leaving her trash bin outside for less than an hour. A man near the front told the group about being harassed over a basketball hoop his kids played with. Another admitted she had been too scared to put out a flower pot because she didn't want to get a violation notice. Voices rose, anger building. For the first time, the board wasn't in control of the meeting. The residents were. The president tried to regain control, slamming her gavel and insisting that the discussion was off topic. But nobody listened. The room was alive with frustration, years of bottled-up resentment finally spilling out. And then I dropped the final blow. I announced that I had contacted a local news outlet, and they were preparing a story on the HOA's attempt to evict a homeowner over a garden gnome. A stunned silence filled the room. The board members looked pale, their eyes darting nervously. They thrived in the shadows, behind closed doors and in intimidating letters. But under public scrutiny, they would crumble. That was the breaking point. The crowd erupted in support. Neighbors began chanting for a vote, demanding accountability. People called for transparency, for a review of the board's actions, and even for resignations. The board president's voice shook as she tried to adjourn the meeting, but the damage was already done. For the first time in years, the community wasn't afraid anymore. The grip of fear that had held the neighborhood in silence was broken. That night, after the meeting, people gathered in small groups in the parking lot, buzzing with energy. They talked about forming a committee, about demanding new elections, about finally taking their neighborhood back. I stood quietly, my gnome still at the center of the storm, realizing just how far things had come. What began as a single violation notice had grown into a full-scale rebellion. But I knew the board wouldn't give up easily. They had ruled unchecked for too long, and their pride wouldn't let them bow out without a fight. The showdown at the meeting was just the beginning. The real battle, the one that would determine who truly held power in the neighborhood, was still to come. And I was ready. The days following the explosive HOA meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. For years, residents had tiptoed around the board, afraid of drawing unwanted attention. Now, that fear had evaporated. Conversations buzzed on sidewalks and driveways. People who had once whispered their frustrations now spoke openly, emboldened by the knowledge that they weren't alone. The board, however, did not retreat quietly. Instead, they lashed out. Within a week, new violation letters began appearing in mailboxes, not just mine, but in the homes of several neighbors who had spoken out at the meeting. Fines were slapped onto accounts for ridiculous reasons. A car tire touching the edge of the grass, a garden hose left out overnight, a patio chair placed too close to the curb. It was retaliation, plain and simple. But this time, things were different. The community was watching closely, and every unfair notice was photographed, copied, and shared among neighbors. What had once been isolated acts of intimidation were now fuel for collective anger. Instead of breaking us, the board's heavy-handed tactics only strengthened the movement against them. Meanwhile, I continued digging. I had a hunch that the Gnome saga was only scratching the surface of the board's corruption. If they were this reckless with power, what else were they hiding? I requested financial records, something every homeowner was entitled to under state law. At first, the board stalled, claiming the documents were not readily available. But after repeated demands, they reluctantly handed over a binder filled with statements and reports. Late into the night, I pored over the pages. Most of it looked routine: landscaping costs, maintenance fees, utility bills. But as I dug deeper, oddities began to appear. Payments to vague consultants with no listed addresses. Reimbursements to board members for community expenses that lacked receipts. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for, with no clear explanation. It didn't take long to see the truth. The board wasn't just enforcing rules unfairly. They were mismanaging, and possibly even stealing, from the very people they claimed to serve. I knew I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. At the next informal gathering in my backyard, I laid out the evidence for my neighbors. Gasps filled the air as I flipped through page after page of suspicious transactions. People were outraged. The gnome may have sparked the fire, but financial corruption was gasoline. Whispers turned into demands. Neighbors wanted the board removed. They wanted accountability. They wanted answers. Some even suggested legal action, proposing we band together to hire an attorney to represent the community against its own HOA. Word spread fast. The board, sensing their power slipping away, scrambled to regain control. They sent out a polished newsletter painting themselves as dedicated volunteers unfairly maligned by misinformation. They claimed the financial irregularities were nothing more than clerical errors. But nobody was buying it. Not anymore. Their desperation showed in smaller ways, too. Board members stopped walking their dogs in the evenings, avoiding contact with residents. The president, once confident and commanding, now drove past my house without making eye contact, her face tight with tension. But the real turning point came when one of their own cracked. It was a quiet evening when I received an envelope slipped anonymously under my door. Inside was a stack of photocopied documents, emails between board members. As I read, my eyes widened. The messages revealed internal arguments, paranoia, and even open admisses. Odds of targeting me with trumped-up violations to make an example. Years of frustration had erupted in a single night, and for once, the people had won. I walked home under the streetlights, exhaustion settling over me. In my yard, waiting just where it always had been, was the Gnome. Its red hat gleamed faintly in the moonlight, its painted grin eternal. What had started as a petty violation had become a battle that toppled an entire regime of intimidation. Neighbors waved to me as they passed, no longer afraid to be seen in my company. Some even joked that the Gnome deserved its own plaque for service to the community. I laughed, but deep down, I knew they were right. The Gnome had become more than a decoration. It was a symbol of resistance, of defiance, of a neighborhood's awakening. The HOA tried to evict me over it. Instead, they had destroyed themselves. And as I stood there in the quiet night, looking at the little ceramic figure, I realized something profound. Sometimes the smallest things can spark the biggest revolutions. The war over the Gnome was finally over, and we had won.